You know why Adam and Eve are said to have had the perfect marriage? That's because she didn't have to hear about his mother's cooking, and he didn't have to hear about all the other men she could have married. Friends, the story of humanity's first failure, as recounted in the Torah, is arguably the far-reaching tragedy of all time. Adam's inability to obey God's command to refrain from eating of the forbidden fruit and his subsequent banishment from the Garden of Eden are generally understood to be the root source of all evil and exile. What makes the story particularly challenging to comprehend is the fact that, as we'll see from text 1, Adam ate from the tree a mere 1 hour after the prohibition came into effect. That's all it took, friends, for the first human being to violate a direct order from God. You can see this in text 1, and then in the 9th he was commanded not to eat of the tree knowledge. In the 10th hour, since he was created, he had already sinned. The obvious question is, how could Adam, called Yitzir Kapav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the handiwork of God Almighty, and the only human being to have been literally breathed into existence by God, not manage to control such a basic urge for more than 1 single hour? The question intensifies based on the commentary of the Or HaChaim and the Chassam Sofer, who both observe that the prohibition to eat from the tree of knowledge was scheduled to expire with the onset of Shabbat, which meant that Adam had only to abstain from eating from the tree for all of 3 hours in total. In the Rebbe's talk on this subject, he explains that the only way to truly understand this story is to explore its broader context. You see, Adam was the first human being created by God himself. He was the ultimate human prototype, literally created b'tselem Elokim, in the divine image. The purpose of his creation was to see whether, despite living in a world and reality where God's presence is concealed, he would nevertheless dedicate himself to the path of truth and righteousness. He was thus placed into the garden along with the snake, who represents the force in creation that constantly pulls us away from all that is good and holy toward that which is destructive and meaningless. Adam's test was whether he could fulfill a single divine command without the revealed presence of God looking over his shoulder, so to speak. This was the archetypal test of the human condition and experiment. The Garden of Eden was the proving ground. Adam's every move would impact, reverberate, and set the course for human history from here on out. The stakes could not have been higher. Let's look at text 2, a quote from the Rebbe's talk. It was precisely because of the enormity of Adam's mission that the snake, symbolizing the inclination to negativity, exerted such enormous energies and focused all of its strength on disturbing Adam's mission, which was simply to abstain from the tree of knowledge. This was indeed a most worrisome moment for the snake, whose entire purpose and reason for existing was to stop man from serving his maker. And to validate his purpose, one can imagine the tremendous effort the snake invested in causing Adam to sin. Friends, if we consider the cosmic stakes on the line, it becomes clear that Adam actually exhibited nearly superhuman restraint by holding off as long as he did. According to the Rebbe's treatment of the story, then, the question is no longer how could Adam succumb to sin so soon, but rather how was Adam able to withstand the evil inclinations' advances for as long as he did? Rather than highlighting humanity's weakness, Adam's story now serves as an inspiring example of the human capacity and tenacity to strive to live a spiritual life in a physical world of distraction, of tests, of temptation, and of the far-reaching effects of each of our actions on the cosmos and history itself. Additionally, Adam's example, when seen through the Rebbe's positivity bias, teaches us that the more difficult and difficulty we encounter when trying to perform a particular good deed, the more essential that good deed is to our mission in life. What a radical and counterintuitive teaching, is it not? Sometimes it's those acts of goodness that come so difficult to us, in which Hashem has planted the seeds of our greatest potential and raison d'être. Friends, in addition to Adam's sin in the garden, the sin of the golden calf is one of the most devastating and catastrophic stories in the Torah. A mere 40 days after experiencing the revelation at Sinai and hearing from God himself, "I am the Lord, do not worship another," the people fashion an idol and they serve it. It is hard to find anything at all redemptive in this seemingly irredeemable episode. Nevertheless, through a close analysis of the text of the golden calf incident, the Rebbe makes the case that the greatest blemish on our national record does not actually begin as a story of religious betrayal or infidelity. He uses classic sources, I must add and stress, because it is absolutely essential to recognize that the Rebbe's ideas were always rooted in traditional Judaism, albeit in sources that were obscure and never brought to the forefront of Jewish consciousness. In a nutshell, the Rebbe suggests that the Jewish people were not initially seeking out a new God to worship. They were seeking a new spiritual leader who would guide them in their service to God. This becomes clear from the verse that introduces the golden calf fiasco, which states, let's look at text 3. Let's look at it with a fresh set of eyes. If you were a biblical commentator, put on your biblical commentator hat for the moment. What do we read? The people saw that Moses delayed in descending the mountain and therefore gathered around Aaron and said, "Rise up, make for us an Elohim who will go before us." It is very important to note that Elohim is a multivalent Hebrew word that can either refer to a deity or to a powerful human leader. For example, let's look at text 4. God said to Moshe, "And he, Aaron, will speak for you to the people. And it will be that he will be your speaker, and you will be his Elohim." Now, of course, that doesn't mean that Aaron will be a deity. Moses will be a deity to Aaron. Instead, it means, as the commentary suggests, that Moshe will take the leadership role. And in the next verse, the Jewish people explain their urgent request to Aaron by crying out, text 5, "For this man Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what became of him." Says Rashi, now we need a new leader who will go before us instead of Moses. Based on this reading, friends, the people desired and felt they required someone or something to replace Moses, who, according to their mistaken calculations, had gone missing. As to why they ended up making a golden calf in particular, that is beyond the scope of this conversation, but it is a fascinating discussion. I would highly recommend you look up the Sicha, the full talk, in full. But the link is absolutely clear based on classic commentaries. Put simply, the Jewish people were not looking to replace God. They were merely looking for a replacement for Moshe. And here's the amazing thing. Immediately upon assuming, albeit mistakenly, that their source of spiritual guidance was gone, the Jewish people set about trying to find a replacement without wasting a moment or sparing any cost. Instead of taking time off from their intense spiritual experience while waiting for Moshe to return, as maybe many of us would have done, they didn't allow a moment to pass before seeking out a new source of inspiration. Friends, needless to say, the Rebbe is not condoning the creation of the golden calf itself, God forbid, which was, of course, a forbidden act and quickly devolved into idol worship. Rather, he is acknowledging a divine spark within their initial intention, which was to ensure that they always had a point of spiritual focus. And that, dear friends, I believe, is a very noteworthy and noble act that we can emulate in our lives. Always seek out a spiritual point of focus and guidance in life. It's important to note that the Rebbe's insistence on always highlighting the good in others was not merely the result of a generous spirit or moral largesse. It was based on a comprehensive belief system that sees goodness and godliness rather than selfishness and wickedness as the indigenous inheritance of each and every soul. A beautiful story is told in the memoir of Rabbi Steindalt of blessed memory. The Rebbe was once asked by a group of students, "What does a Rebbe do?" The Rebbe replied, "The Jewish people are like the earth, which contains nature's treasures hidden underneath. One needs to know, however, where to dig. Freud dug in the human soul and found swampy waters and mire. Adler found rocks. Contemporary psychiatry searches for ills and traumas that must be uprooted, but when a Rebbe digs, he finds gold, silver, and diamonds. You see, friends, our methods and maps of reality determine what we seek and find within ourselves and within others. Take the following illustration, for example, on below text 5. Many of you might be familiar with that. Look at that image for a moment. What is it that you see? Anybody? Indeed. By raise of hand, does anybody see a young woman with her face turned away? By raise of hand, does anyone see an older woman looking a little bit mournful and sad? Fascinating, isn't it? We're all looking at the same image, and yet we see very different things. Friends, this is called the My Wife and My Mother-in-Law Optical Illusion. I did not come up with that title. It's one of the most famous optical illusions, and it hinges on facial perception. You can either see a young woman turning away or the profile of an older woman staring solemnly towards the left side of the drawing. However, you can only see one at a time. Now, if you've ever wondered why you see whichever woman you see, this is fascinating. An Australian study conducted by 2 psychology professors concluded that it has to do with your age. This is not my study. According to the study, a younger person will more likely see the younger woman first, while those who are older will likely see the older woman first. Once again, not my study. Thoreau once said, "It's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see." And what you see is so often deeply affected by who you are. I'm reminded of a fascinating Facebook post I came across on Humans of New York. Anybody familiar with it? There was a photo of 2 doctors sitting on a park bench. This is what the caption said: "We are eye doctors, and what is something about the eye that most people don't realize? The eye doesn't see, the brain sees. The eye just transmits. So what we see isn't only determined by what comes through our eyes. What we see is affected by our memories, by our feelings, and by what we've seen before." You see, who we are colors our expectations of others, which in turn contributes to their character sketch in our eyes. Often, our image of the other has more to do with us than it does to do with them. As the Baal Shem Tov taught so beautifully, you see what is inside of you. Therefore, the more you condition yourself to look for the good in others, the more good in others you will see. On a bit of a lighter note, they tell the story about 2 men who meet on the street. One says, "Rappaport, you changed so much. Look at you, you lost weight, you got a facelift, you got a hair transplant. I wouldn't have known it's you." The other fellow says, "I'm not Rappaport." The first guy says, "Look at that, you even changed your name." Friends, one of my favorite stories about the Rebbe's positivity bias, I heard from a person who heard it from the person with whom it happened. It's a story about a young Hasidic man from a different court, from a different Hasidic dynasty and community, who came to seek out the Rebbe's blessing for a child. Parenthetically, he asked his own Rebbe for a blessing, and his Rebbe gave him a blessing. He says, "I want a promise." His Rebbe says, "That I cannot do. The only one who can give you a promise is the Lubavitcher Rebbe." And so he made his way to Crown Heights, and he meets with the Rebbe, and after discussing his personal issue and receiving a blessing, and mind you, that blessing came true, the Rebbe asked the Chassid to share a Torah thought from his Rebbe. The Chassid replied that my Rebbe recently concluded a particular tractate of the Talmud where it says, a fascinating statement, and I quote, "Even the sinners among the Jewish people have as many good deeds as a pomegranate has seeds." And so his Rebbe asked the obvious question, isn't that statement contradictory, oxymoronic? If in fact they are sinners of Israel, of the Jewish people, how can we say that they're filled with good deeds like a pomegranate is filled with seeds? The Rebbe grew very serious. He closed his eyes, and tears began to stream down his face. He opens his eyes, he looks up, and he responded earnestly, "I studied the very same passage in the Talmud, and I too have a question. If the Jew we speak of is truly full of good deeds, like a pomegranate is filled with seeds, how can the Talmud call him a sinner among the Jewish people? Obviously, these different viewpoints had nothing to do with the percentage of good deeds versus sins performed by those whom the Talmud calls sinners of Israel. For we all know that even those who sin have some merit as well, and by the same token, even righteous people have shortcomings. The real question raised by this story is therefore one of essence. Are these Jews essentially sinners who have performed a few good deeds, or are they fundamentally righteous at their root, regardless of the fact that they may have made some mistakes? In other words, what defines the human essence? The inclination to do good or its opposite? Which force is intrinsic to the soul and which is imported? The Rebbe argued time and time again, often in the face of extreme opposition, that it is goodness and godliness of the soul that defines who and what a Jew is, regardless of their level of Jewish knowledge or observance. Here then is a classic example of two individuals looking at an identical text but seeing something vastly different. As illustrated by the story, we are all inescapably biased in some way. The question is this: what is your bias? When you judge others, or even yourself, are you actively looking to emphasize the positive or its opposite? It is for you to decide, for at the end of the day, we see what we are looking for. As a final illustration of the Rebbe's redemptive limutzchus, I'd like to share an example that moved me personally so profoundly that it jump-started a personal journey which culminated in a book that I published a few years ago titled Positivity Bias. If I were to identify the exact moment when the Rebbe's positivity bias first began to crystallize in my mind, without a doubt, it would be the first time I heard the soul-stirring teaching of the Rebbe I'm about to share with you. Let me set the scene. It's the era leading up to the story of Hanukkah. And Antiochus, the king of the Syrian Greek Empire, wanted to consolidate and homogenize his empire. With this agenda in mind, he issues decrees ordering all of his subjects to conform to the dominant Hellenistic Greek culture, customs, and creed. Disobedience was often punished by death. And it was during that period that a Jewish woman named Miriam Bat Bilga abandoned Judaism, converted out of the faith, became Hellenized, and ends up marrying a high-ranking anti-Semitic Greek officer. When the Greeks stormed the temple in an effort to desecrate and defile the house of God, she accompanied her anti-Semitic husband, who was carrying a pig to place upon the altar. Upon reaching the altar, she struck it with her sandal disrespectfully, crying out, "Wolf, wolf!" comparing the altar to a wolf that devours the daily offering of 2 sheep. You consume the Jewish people's wealth, but you don't answer them in their time of need. When the Holy Temple was finally restored and the priestly families resumed their sacred service, the family of Bilga was penalized for Miriam's act of sacrilege towards the altar. I'd like to draw your attention to the following video.
Der Limutzchus, was da Bilga Basmilia. Zet men a viele in Azami Maime du Matze, von Emiro Dosso, wenn es Sali, und gegangen mit den Goyen, was ein gegangen in Beis Amigdash. Verstehen Sie, dass nie gewesen in der Nefesh Altar. Allah has kamen, wir kamen bei ihm. Was hat gehabt, für was der Mizbeach nicht Medien auf Ayiden? Und da sagt man, was ein jüdisch Kind ist, nicht der sagt, was hat noch gehalten mit ihnen und hat angenommen Jerusalem, hat angenommen der Beis Hamikdash, angenommen die Mizbeach. Und sie geht mit ihm mit als ein Sami, was ein Scheich ist. Schaut danach, aber sie da sagt, was tut sich mit der zweiten Nieden, schreit sie, Lukus, Lukus, für was hältst du die Nieden? Verfasst erzählt, dass die Gemorre Komer Lejil, nicht hast wir schon in Sappe Begnusum Shal Yisrael. Adrab in Druf darf man die Gemorre erzählt, dass gedei zu beweisen, was Yid ist.
There it is, the moment that sparked a fire in my soul. More than the Rebbe's breathtaking teaching itself, it was the heart-wrenching way in which it was delivered. The Rebbe's voice literally choking up as he struggled to catch his breath from the tidal wave of empathy and emotion that welled up from the very depths of his being. You see, for the Rebbe, this was not a theoretical exercise in mental gymnastics or some form of starry-eyed spiritual poetry. As we shall discover shortly, on this occasion, as on so many others, the Rebbe vigorously assumed the role of indefatigable defense attorney to the Jewish people, standing before the judges and juries of heaven and earth, arguing and advocating the case not of a client, but of a sister, one he may never have met, yet knew more about than even she did. But truth be told, there's more to the Rebbe's advocacy on behalf of some of Jewish history's greatest transgressors and transgressions than merely a gentler and more nuanced reading of the human condition. As can be inferred from the Rebbe's own words, I will share momentarily. During these Farbrengens, the Rebbe used the text of Torah as a celestial portal and transporter by which to traverse the hallways and holding cells of heaven, rehabilitating the lost souls of history through the act of finding merit where no one else dared to look. I did not include the following in the book. Perhaps I didn't feel like the wider audience was ready to receive this information, but I do feel that the current audience is very much ready. So let me share with you the Rebbe's own words. It was Simchat Torah 1974. Mere weeks after the Rebbe had publicly recast Miriam Bat Bilga as a poster girl for a Yiddish imam, incensed by the pain and the humiliation of her people and infused with what we could only call holy chutzpah. Apparently, the Rebbe had received a backlash from certain critics who felt that he had gone too far this time with his limud zchus of Miriam Bat Bilga. And on that most joyous and elevated of days, the Rebbe took the time to address his critics in two ways. First, he made clear that seeking out the merit in another was not his own invention. It is a clear directive of the Mishnah. Let's look at text 8. Hevedan et kol adam likaf zechut. One should endeavor to judge every individual favorably. He then shared a mind-blowing story whose lesson and takeaway he left open for interpretation. The Alter Rebbe was once studying with his inner circle of disciples when an individual was brought before him who was possessed by a spirit, or what some might call a dibuk, a soul from the past, which attaches itself to a living person. The Alter Rebbe began to share a fascinating limud zchus relating to the infamous murderers of Zechariah, the prophet, some thousands of years ago. He explained that their rationale for taking the life of this prophet was that they had become aware of the fact that he was about to verbalize, to vocalize a prophecy about the destruction of the Holy Temple, and they hoped to stop that prophecy from materializing by ensuring that it never be spoken into existence. You see, our sages and the Jewish codifiers teach that a negative prophecy which has not yet been spoken can still be rescinded by God, since it has not yet become manifest through the power and the properties of speech. Once vocalized, however, a prophecy can no longer linger or hover in the spiritual realms, but must be realized on our physical plane of existence. Hence, the Alter Rebbe concluded that Zechariah's murderers were actually tzaddikim on some level, willing to sacrifice their own lives and legacies in order to prevent the ultimate catastrophe for the Jewish people, the destruction of the Holy Temple. No sooner had the Alter Rebbe finished this Torah that the spirits which had previously inhabited this individual departed, leaving him be. Explaining what had just happened to his students, the Alter Rebbe disclosed that the spirits which had taken hold of this individual belonged to none other than the murderers of Zechariah, and due to the severity of their sin, their souls had not found peace for thousands of years until that very moment when the Alter Rebbe had identified some modicum of merit, some positive way of interpreting an otherwise unforgivable act. My understanding of how this works is that there are certain souls who committed acts so heinous in their lifetime that they cannot even be admitted to Gehinnom, to purgatory, to begin their healing process. These souls are thus lost and trapped in the profoundest sense, doomed to eternal wandering, angst, and isolation. In extreme circumstances, as was the case in the story above, they can attach themselves to living beings and can only be exorcised by spiritual masters through the power of Limud Zchut. After sharing this story at that Simchat Torah Farbrengen, the Rebbe concluded simply, such is the power of Limud Zchut. Now my question for you is, what do you make of this story? What do you think the Rebbe was getting at? To my mind, and I only speak for myself, by sharing this story in the context of the criticism he had received for his Limud Zechut for Miriam Bat Bilga, it seems clear to me that what Hasidim could not have known on that day was that, like his ancestor, the Alter Rebbe before him, the Rebbe too had engaged in that ultimate act of kindness, chesed shel emes, by spiritually repatriating a precious soul which had been trapped and tormented for millennia. Unless you find this whole idea too mystical or trippy, and question whether this idea is exotic or indigenous to traditional Judaism, buckle up for the following teaching. There is a Mishnah which tells the following story. Let's look at text 9. Hillel the elder once saw a skull floating on the water. Said he to it, because you drowned others, you were drowned. And those who drowned you will themselves be drowned. Avot 2:6. Maimonides' grandson, Rabbi David Hanagid, cites a fascinating tradition handed down by the early ones, that the floating skull Hillel encounters on that day belonged to none other than the wicked Pharaoh from the Passover story. Hence Hillel's words, because you drowned others, you were drowned, takes on new meaning when we consider Pharaoh's decree to drown all Jewish males in the Nile. The master Kabbalist, the Holy Arizal, goes one step further, teaching that the soul of Hillel contained a spark of the soul of Moshe Rabbeinu, highlighting the similarities between them. They both lived to 120, for example. The Arizal concludes that it was therefore most fitting that of all people, it should be Hillel, the reincarnation of Moses, to confront that skull of Pharaoh, communicating in simple terms that what comes around goes around. But there's more. In his commentary on Pirkei Avot, the Rebbe asks a question relating to the above teaching of Hillel that, in my view, only the Rebbe would ask. Why would Hillel rebuke someone who was already dead and therefore no longer in a position to rectify his deeds? As a frame of reference for this question, according to Jewish law, men are meant to tuck in their tzitzit when they visit a graveyard, since wearing them could potentially be deemed mocking the dead who no longer have the opportunity to perform a mitzvah. And hence, asks the Rebbe, what possible value or constructive purpose was there in Hillel's statement to the skull of Pharaoh? Because you drowned others, you were drowned. The Rebbe's explanation is stunning. When Hillel saw that heaven had caused him to cross paths with the skull of Pharaoh, he realized that the time had finally come for Pharaoh's tortured soul to find peace. He therefore used Pharaoh to derive an instructive lesson that would benefit others, thereby bringing merit to Pharaoh and enabling his soul to finally find respite. This, dear friends, provides a window into the unique and ubiquitous pattern that emerges throughout the Rebbe's talks, where time and time again the Rebbe endeavors to find the virtue in the villain and the saint within the sinner. During those many farbrengens, he may well have been communicating on different levels and to different audiences, past and present, of heaven and of earth. Indeed, I would posit that through his forays into the higher worlds and heavenly courts, the Rebbe embarked on a daring initiative, taking the mitzvah to love one's fellow to unprecedented levels, engaging in what might best be called intergenerational pidyon shivuyim, redeeming of captives, in an extraordinary show of dedication, not just to the souls that lived in his time, but to all souls to have ever lived. Now, for those of us who feel that our reach is slightly more limited and earthbound, there still is something we can each take away, which is perhaps even more urgent and relevant than ever before in a world that has become increasingly cynical and polarized. For those of us who feel that, let me share with you one particular area where a good eye is transformational, an ayin tov, is in personal relationships, whether at work or within the family. You see, interpersonal relationships are complicated. They're messy. As we each have different views, associations, narratives, word choices, and insecurities, creating near constant opportunities for misunderstanding and for judgment. In any conversation or encounter, there is the possibility for misappropriation of meaning and intention, which gives rise to unnecessary skepticism and the breakdown of trust. On a bit of a lighter note, there are two English words that seem identical but couldn't be more different. Those words are complete and finished. And what's the difference between them? Well, if you marry the right person, you're complete. So a person can easily fall into a default mode in which they immediately assume the worst about people. Take, for example, the story of a little girl who's holding 2 apples, one in each hand. Her mother comes in and asks the little girl, "Sweetie, could you give Mom one of your apples?" The girl looks up for a moment, then she suddenly took a quick bite of one apple and then takes a quick bite out of the other. The mom felt the smile on her face freeze. The little girl then handed one of her bitten apples to her mom and said, "Mommy, here you are. This one is the sweeter one." This is especially true in marriages, friends, where so often we see current interactions through the prism and prison of past experiences. And hence, perhaps a deeper meaning of living in the here and now would be to approach every encounter with fresh eyes, disassociating it from the past, the baggage, those assumptions. The here he goes again, the here she goes again, and trying to really encounter every interaction with an open canvas. Friends, imagine how positive and kind our daily encounters could be if we would adopt the Rebbe's ayin tov and condition ourselves to view others more generously. Imagine a world in which the baseline of human interaction is extending others the benefit of doubt. Such a world would draw forth and activate the inherent kindness of our nature in a never-ending loop of mutual reinforcement. And so before I conclude with a beautiful video, I'd like to invite everybody to take a moment and perhaps close your eyes and identify a close person or relationship in your life which may be colored by negative or cynical assumptions, by predispositions, by the past, and resolve to give that person or relationship another chance to start afresh with a new set of eyes which are looking for merit, not mistakes. Be specific as possible. And hopefully, when we leave this room today and we go back into the streets of life, we may just be able to repair a broken relationship. Friends, I'd like to conclude with one final clip.
I was at Torres Chaim, which was on Belmont Avenue in Brooklyn. Shortly before my 10th birthday, my mother and my baby sister and myself went to see the Rebbe. We went to 770, and my mother started to talk to the Rebbe. My son, Shalom, he's been thrown out of the yeshivas, and the rabbi says this, and he's not listening, and the rabbis are complaining he doesn't like the school, he doesn't like the homework, he doesn't like the program, he likes eating stuff in class, and then my mother's crying and crying because she was searching for answers. The Rebbe turns to me, and he smiles, and he goes, "Come here." So I started the conversation. Because I was ready. I said to the Rebbe, "You're the Rebbe?" So the Rebbe looks at me with a big smile. He says to me 3 questions. The first question was, "Are you a good boy?" I said, "No," with conviction. I was ready. I was used to the scene. So then he says, "You like school?" I said, "No." Then he says to me, "Do you listen to your mother?" I said, "No." So with a big smile, he turns to my mother and he goes, Emes, it's good." He said I was Emes. At that point, it pulled me right back into the Yiddishkeit.
What a powerful story. You see, friends, here's a man who came to the Rebbe as a rebellious child, ready to pick a good fight. But all of that resistance melted away the moment he encountered someone who saw in him innocence, not insolence, the truth behind the tirade, and someone who defined him by his divine soul rather than by his defiant spirit. Like Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Raditcha before him, the Rebbe diagnosed this man's essence as inherently good and honest. Sagt emes. He speaks the truth. And so, in conclusion, friends, if you can take one thing alone out of today's talk, let it be this final thought. If you change the way you look at people, the people you look at change. Here's to changing our world, one person and one limud zchus at a time. Thank you.